name is Amber Brown. My dad is here tonight to share some of his story, and my daughter is here to share as well. My other daughter and son are here to support us, as are many friends and other family members. We're a family and friends of stories. Growing up, I didn't really know my mom. She left my little brother and me in the capable, loving hands of my dad when I was only 4, and Joe wasn't even a year old. Leaving us was probably the best but most difficult decision she ever made, but she knew she had to, for us and also for herself. My dad will tell you his story, but to me, my mother was a bundle of furiously scribbled letters written in different colored inks, stopped and started over a course of hours or days, torn out of spiral notebooks and mailed 14, 20, 28 pages at a time, with no particular purpose or meaning as far as I could tell, except to let me know she was thinking of me, and perhaps to release some of the madness that was running rampant in her mind. My mother was a genius, literally. She was a member of Mensa. She knew the question to almost every single answer on Jeopardy. My mother also had a horse named Blossom that lived in her closet and changed colors with the seasons. She worked for the Department of Defense 14 stories below ground, so I'd need sweaters when I visited her in the summer because it would be cold that down. She said that C.S. Lewis was her biological father, my grandfather, and that I should contact his children to let them know that I was the true heir to the lost manuscript he'd hidden in a secret compartment in the bottom left drawer of his writing desk. My mother was addicted to these delusions of grandeur. Without them, her life was mundane, and she was meant for much more than mundane. In her mind, she was queen, and her reign was supreme. The medications slowed down her quick wit, blinded her imagination, and bloated her already thick frame. In the 80s, high doses of lithium were about all that was available, and the meds didn't get much better in her lifetime. I remember a summer where she spent every minute pulling at an invisible hair on her tongue, a minor annoyance whose persistence made it a kind of Chinese water torture to her and to everyone trying to hold a conversation with her. Due to side effects from her many medications, my mother couldn't drive and she couldn't hold a job, but still it took her 8 years of constant battle to be able to claim disability. In the last 3 years of her life, she finally got on a series of medications that seemed to be working. She had her own apartment right next door to Ozark Guidance. She was as self-sufficient as she ever could be, though she did have a full-time crew of family, mental health professionals, and friends that she would not have survived without. The mental health system in Northwest Arkansas and in America is in much more demand than we have resources for. And except for the 7 years my mom and dad were married, a few months of failed attempts at independence, and the last few years of her life, my mother lived for more than 40 years with her mother and her extended family. My grandma Marcella, my great-granddad Key, my cousins Jennifer and Joel, and my Aunt Vicki. My Uncle Bill and Uncle Jim were always in her corner, and my Aunt Beth was her constant champion. If they hadn't helped her navigate the impossible tangled mess of red tape it takes to acquire and keep assistance, if they hadn't arranged appointments and driven her to them, if they hadn't bought and prepared meals, if they hadn't taken her to the store, if they hadn't gotten her out of the house from time to time, if they hadn't given her a roof over her head, she would never have survived for as long as she did. As it is, she died much too soon due to complications from years of an ever-changing regimen of mind and body-altering medications, and the medications she took to counteract the side effects of those medications. My dear uncle found her dead, naked on the floor of her apartment a couple of days after she didn't show up for a lunch date. I wish she could have been alive to be a part of something like this, the stories she could have told. Because of her own difficult life and a deep-seated fear for her daughter's fragile sanity, my mother begged me not to have children. My mother was always delusional, but I don't think the depression was debilitating until after she gave birth to us. I didn't really know much about her mental illness, but what I did know was terrifying to me. So I just always assumed I wouldn't have my own children. But life happens as it does, and I did have children. One of my twin daughters was diagnosed initially with schizophreniform when she was only 13 years old. I had always been vigilant for my own signs of madness and was ready to be on the lookout for signs of mental illness in my own children. But she was so young. It was a year or so before Bailey could make me understand that her nightmares were more than just usual childhood fears. I'm thankful for her ability to be open with me and to be persistent in making me understand. And I'm especially grateful for the doctor who convinced me to make the terrifying decision to start my baby girl on an antipsychotic to try to retrain her bent brain. It was a hard journey full of potholes and detours and roads less traveled. I watched her transform into a completely different person than the girl I had raised. I watched her fight to gain control over her anger and impatience. I witnessed her studious, tenacious approach to learn peace and acceptance. Her counselor told me he'd never known anyone to work so hard for their own wellness. She fought. With her doctor's recommendation and close watch, she's actually been off of all meds for about 7 months. And she seems to have no signs of the schizoaffective disorder, which in her case, the doctors now think are triggered by depression. There are a lot of big hormonal and life changes coming, and we will never not be watching and waiting for the return of symptoms. But I don't fear for her anymore. She has a vast array of tools and the skill and the will to use them. She's amazing and she inspires me every day, as do her twin sister and her older brother, who both fight their own dilemmas with such style and grace and panache and such startling senses of humor. As for my own story, due to a series of events that were beyond even my wildest imagination, I found myself as the mother to 3 beautiful children by the time I was 21. There were many, many times that I felt as brittle as an antique teacup. But I guess I was more resilient than I could have ever hoped to be. It's been a 40-year roller coaster ride. I'm very lucky to have a support group of most loving friends and family. But there were times, not the first episode by any means, but one of the defining ones. A few years ago, I was working for the largest, really, locally based company. I had the overnight shift, and after 3 years of juggling sleeping days when I worked and trying to stay up days on the weekends so I could spend time with my kids for 3 years, I completely lost all control. On Christmas Eve. A few days later, I pulled myself together enough to file for a mental health leave. And after a couple of months of therapy and medication, I felt much better. But because I no longer had a check to take my insurance out of, I couldn't afford the doctor visit to get clearance to go back to work. And I also knew that even if I could get back to work there, I wouldn't survive another year of sleep deprivation from trying to juggle overnight shifts and time with my family. I honestly don't know how I did it. The memories are mostly a blur. A few years later, I'd begun a promising career in the mortgage industry. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't classified as one of the working poor. And then suddenly, almost overnight it seemed, the wind was knocked out of me, literally. My lungs could not draw enough breath. I had terrible, persistent pain in my joints. I was exhausted, but I couldn't fall asleep. And when I did fall asleep, I couldn't stay asleep. I was plagued with migraines. I put off going to the doctor for as long as I could because I'd never been sick with anything I couldn't shake. I worked from a computer at home waiting to feel better. But after a few weeks when I started sleeping on the couch because I couldn't get up my stairs, I finally decided it was time to go to the doctor. I gave him my laundry list of symptoms, thinking he was going to send me off for a barrage of tests to solve my medical history Dr. House style. Instead, he looked me in the eye and he paused before he said, "With most people, I dance around this a little bit, but because of your family history and because of the honest relationship you have with your own children, I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there. You're depressed." I shook my head. I'm not depressed. For the first time in my entire life, I'm making enough money to pay my bills. Do you have any idea how not depressing that is? He said, "Amber, depression is a misnomer. You, of all people, should know this. It's not sadness. It's a chemical imbalance. It's not situational for you right now. It's brain chemistry. This is physical. Depression is a physical ailment. And still when I went back to work, I told my boss that the whole thing, the weeks I'd been home-ridden, it was all due to issues with my thyroid. My thyroid was low, just a notch below normal. My thyroid problems at that time were minor. The depression was debilitating. Mental illness is not in the mind. We should be treating mental illness like we would treat any physical ailment. For some, mental illness is situational or can be triggered by events or trauma, but the sickness that is triggered is exactly that, a sickness. Mental illness is not something to be hidden or ashamed of, but something to be spoken about and understood so it can be treated. Thank you for letting me tell my story.